2026 regulations with the latest Pirelli tire test. And it might tell us more about the future than you think. Ferrari and McLaren were on track, as well as Alpine with this beautiful slicked out black in that BWT, with Lewis Hamilton obviously driving the SF24 for the first time, and Charles Leclerc making up for lost lap time due to the crash that happened in the SF23 in the previous testing session. And obviously the McLaren duo of Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri both got in plenty of laps that we'll go over on the Spain track as well. But while these lap times really don't matter, who am I kidding? Lewis Hamilton beat him out by a 10th. He is definitely winning the championship. Screw Charles Leclerc. This is all for Lewis. No, we're not doing that. These lap times really do not matter, and I mean genuinely, but it's good to go over the amount of laps they've done. And of course, this is also for Lewis to get a handle of the Ferrari car, and in general to see how these tires behave so they can prepare for their new cars, as every team will run these 2026 tires. The Aston Martin car has ran it on its AMR 22 to help out with this test, and they'll probably have a couple more tests with even the AMR 23, possibly the AMR 24 later in the year. Mercedes and Alpine will also be running it back with McLaren later on the 13th and the 14th of February, so these tests are still not over. But the car configurations here absolutely matter, so I want to go over that. And it gives valuable insight on how the 2026 tires behave and why they configure the car in a specific way towards those tires. And as I stated, it gives them a bit of early data that they can use for the 2026 car, depending on how they're going to develop their car in the 2026 regulations. So what exactly did we learn, and how different are these prototype tires? And before breaking it all down, I want to say thank you guys for support on the channel per usual. You guys are amazing. Changed up a bit of the background, still in the works, but let me know what you think about it. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. It would mean the world. But let's get started with this 2026 tire test video. So as I stated before, just to get these lap times out of the way, Lewis Hamilton on the first day put in a 1:15.930, and Charles Leclerc was about a 10th behind with a 1:16.060. Now obviously Lewis proved that he's much faster than Charles Leclerc here, as I stated before, but on the next day, Charles Leclerc dunked on him and Oscar Piastri a fat margin. But as I'm going to reiterate again, these lap times really do not matter. It's more about the amount of laps that they put in, as Leclerc and Hamilton both put in 74 laps, while Oscar Piastri put in 152 laps, which was the limit of these programs that they could run. Oscar ran it on this day. The day before, it was Lando that ran about 152 laps as well. Now to talk about the car configuration, because this plays a big contributing factor in these 2026 cars. And before I go over the tires, just take a look at the car, and what's the first thing that you notice? If you look at it closely, this car is set up in a very low downforce setup. But why is that? On the car, we see a Monza spec of wing. The one that Ferrari brought on its SF24 is placed on the car, as well as the front wing. Very low in downforce on both the front wing and the rear wing. And this is because the 2026 cars, as they arrive into the regulations, will have a lot less downforce than the current generation of cars, especially the ones we're going to see in 2025, which is estimated to be around 20 to 40% less. Now there are other ways as they're gaining this lap time, because these lap times are supposed to be pretty similar to that of what we have right now in 2026 because of it being a lighter car. But to get a better idea of how this test is going and whether the tires are actually working, they went with this low downforce configuration, and the tires are slightly narrower. And this does also produce a lot less drag, which the 2026 cars will do, whether they're in mode Z or X. And obviously the shape and the size of the wake/tire jet also changes, so there are other aerodynamic effects to consider. Another thing to assume with this version of this SF24 is that the car is a little bit less in weight than it usually is. The 2024 car had a weight limit of 798 kilos. I assume that they took out some of the ballast, whether that's in the front or the rear of the car, to help with the 40 kilo reduction we do have in 2026. So this is not obviously going to be the same car, and some of the lap times that you're going to see produced by Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton and Lando and Oscar can be swayed by that. These cars probably did not go flat in turns 9 and obviously the last turn, as they have less downforce, and it's going to be a lot tougher for these new regulation of cars to be able to take them like that without seeing the aero improvements that the teams are going to make taking this first step into 2026. It's also important to know that we don't know the fuel on these cars, so yet again, I'm going to say it, these lap times do not mean a thing. But here's a great comparison pick from 2024 to 2026 to test, showing you how much more narrow these tires are. And some people are saying there will be a loss of downforce because there's a little bit less grip with the tires being a bit more narrow, but that is compensated through the weight and the cars being less draggy. So there shouldn't be a disadvantage to this. If anything, it's better for the teams to actually develop those cars to get to the weight limit if the tire is a bit more narrow and smaller. And I do think it looks a bit better looking at this picture in comparison, just slightly a bit better. For reference, the quali time in 2024 was a 1:11, and the fastest time we saw with Leclerc was about a 1:15 in the 1:14s. And in race pace, the fastest time that Lando set was a 1:17.115. And because we don't know the fuel, these lap times are pretty irrelevant to even compare, but just to give you a rough idea. This was probably the best time for Lewis to really pick up on the Ferrari ways, as he was driving the most recent car, and while he was driving it in a very different iteration and the car is going to perform much more differently to that of the actual 2024 car, it's nice that he got a lot of lap time in. We do know now that both him and Leclerc will run the car on the 19th of February for that 2025 SF25 that we're just waiting for to see. We also got to hear our first 2025 car with that McLaren. Sounds very sexy, and I cannot wait to see that thing on track. I love the look of the actual McLaren too. This black and orange with no sponsors looks very clean. I wish the Ferrari car would have done that, but obviously they know the amount of media attention they've been getting since Lewis has arrived to the team, so that's why we see a fully decked out sponsored Ferrari car, and the McLaren car has took off the sponsors on its previous iteration of car. So it's pretty cool to actually see that they are testing these tires in the proper environment with these low downforce iteration of cars, and it's nice to see Lewis finally in the most recent car. It'll be very cool to see him in the SF25, which is coming soon. And 2026 is ramping up very quickly because these cars are getting produced right now aerodynamically and those engines. So these tests play a very important part for now Ferrari and McLaren as well as Alpine to develop that car and take it to that next step, seeing the airflow, how the drag is being affected on a completely different iteration of car. We got to remember these cars are still very floor oriented, while the 2026 cars are going to put a lot more focus on the upper part of the car. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Please don't fall for all these crazy things coming out about Lewis being so much faster or Charles Leclerc on these lap times. They're very irrelevant, and what we really need to learn from here is the configuration of car and why it's helpful for the teams going into the new regulations. Some new cars coming up. I'm very excited. And obviously you guys are going to be getting a lot of videos very soon. So thank you all for sticking around. Please leave a like, subscribe. It would mean the world. And peace. Oops. Peace. Gotta get used to that.